For 63 years, I thought I understood what silence meant. Silence after a long day's work. Silence at the dinner table when the kids were small and too tired to argue. Silence in the car on the way home from the hospital, the day the doctor first used the word deteriorating. But the silence I heard when I pressed play on that footage, that was a different kind of silence entirely. That was the silence of a man whose whole world had just rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. My name is Douglas Hartley. I spent 38 years as a structural engineer in Brisbane, built a life the slow and honest way, brick by brick, as they say. My wife, Margaret, was an art teacher for most of those years. We met at a community fair in Toowoomba when we were both 24, and she laughed at something I said before I even finished saying it. I married her 11 months later. We had 2 children together. Our son, Brendan, lives up in Cairns now with his wife and their 3 boys. And our daughter, Leanne. I need you to understand something before I go any further. For most of her life, Leanne was a good person. She was sharp, funny, the kind of woman who remembered every birthday and sent actual handwritten cards. When Margaret first started getting sick, this was about 4 years ago now, a slow neurological decline the doctors couldn't fully pin down. Leanne was the first one at our door. She drove down from the Gold Coast twice a month. She researched specialists. She made spreadsheets of medications and appointments. I was grateful in a way I didn't even have words for. I was 61 years old, watching my wife fade, and my daughter showed up like a lifeline. That gratitude, I think, is what made everything that came after so hard to see. Margaret's condition worsened through that second year. She started having trouble with her balance, then with her memory, then with her speech. The neurologist, Dr. Pereira, a decent man who I trusted completely, said it was consistent with a rare degenerative condition, one that progressed differently in every patient. He adjusted her medications several times. Some months she seemed to plateau. Other months, the decline was noticeable within a week. About 2 years ago, Leanne suggested she move in with us temporarily. Her marriage to her husband, Craig, had ended the previous year amicably, she said. She had flexibility in her work. She did bookkeeping for several small businesses remotely. It made sense, she said. I needed help. Margaret needed consistent care. Leanne needed somewhere to land while she figured out her next chapter. I said yes without hesitation. For the first few months, the arrangement was genuinely good. Leanne took over the medication schedule, organized the house, cooked most evenings. I was still working part-time 2 days a week, consulting for a firm in the valley, and knowing Margaret was being looked after took a weight off me that I hadn't realized I was carrying. Margaret seemed comfortable with Leanne there. She smiled more. She slept better. Or so I thought. The first thing I noticed, and I want to be honest, I noticed it, and then I chose not to look at it directly, was that Leanne started going into Margaret's room at night. Not every night at first. Maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I'd get up to use the bathroom around 2 in the morning and see the thin line of light under Margaret's door. I'd hear Leanne's voice, low and murmuring. I told myself it was Margaret having trouble sleeping, that Leanne was keeping her company. Margaret had always been a light sleeper. It seemed, on the surface, like devotion, but then it became every night, without exception, and sometimes, twice. I mentioned it to Leanne once, gently, over breakfast. I said something like, I heard you up with your mum again last night. You don't have to do that, love. You need your sleep too. She smiled at me and said Margaret got anxious in the dark and that she was just checking on her. She said it the way you say something obvious, the way you'd explain to a child why the sky is blue. I nodded and poured my tea and told myself I was lucky to have a daughter like her. But something had lodged in me. Something small and sharp that I couldn't quite dislodge. I want to be clear about why I didn't act immediately. I was 62 years old, still processing my wife's illness, still going to work 2 days a week and pretending I was holding everything together. I was not the kind of man who trusted dark suspicions about his own daughter. I had spent my career building things that were meant to hold weight. I believed in structural integrity, in things being what they appeared to be. The idea that Leanne might be doing something harmful was, to me, like being told that a bridge I designed was rotten from the inside. My instinct was to reject it before I'd even properly examined it. And then Margaret had a bad week. It was a Tuesday in March. This would be about 18 months ago now. Margaret could barely get out of bed. She was confused in a way that was different from her usual confusion, more acute, more frightened. Her hands were trembling visibly. I called Dr. Pereira, and he came out the next day, did a thorough examination, adjusted her medication again. He told me these fluctuations were part of the condition. He told me to monitor her and call if she got worse. She didn't get worse. By the following weekend, she was better, noticeably better. Back to something closer to her baseline. Chatting a little, eating properly, I thought. The new medication is working, but the pattern repeated. 3 weeks later, another bad stretch. Then a recovery. Then another decline. It went on like this for months, and every time I raised it with Dr. Pereira, he explained it as consistent with the fluctuating nature of her condition. He was never dismissive exactly, just very certain. Certain in a way that, looking back, should have made me curious. What made me finally act was a small thing. A glass of water. I had come home earlier than expected on a Thursday afternoon. A meeting had been canceled, and I walked into the kitchen to find Leanne at the bench with her back to me. She was stirring something into a glass of water. When she heard me come in, she turned quickly, and the expression on her face before she replaced it with a smile that half-second, that involuntary flash, was not the face of someone doing something innocent. It was the face of someone caught. She said it was a powdered vitamin supplement for Margaret. She showed me the container. It looked legitimate. I said nothing. I went to my study and I sat at my desk for a long time, and the sharp thing that had been lodged in me since those nighttime visits finally worked its way to the surface. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed, and I thought about every strange decline, every mysterious recovery, every conversation with Dr. Pereira that had left me feeling vaguely unsatisfied. I thought about the nighttime visits. I thought about that expression. The next morning, while Leanne was at the shops, I went to a technology store and bought a small wireless camera. Nothing elaborate, a simple device that connected to an app on my phone. I installed it in Margaret's room that afternoon, up on the bookshelf near the window, angled toward the bed. I told myself I was probably going to feel foolish. I told myself that in a week, I'd take it down and never mention it to anyone. I did not feel foolish. On the third night, at approximately 12 minutes past 1 in the morning, I watched on my phone as Leanne came into Margaret's room carrying a glass and a small bottle I didn't recognize. She spoke softly to Margaret, helped her sit up, gave her something from the bottle drops. It looked like, counted carefully, and then gave her the glass. Margaret drank it without protest. The way you drink something when you've been told it's medicine for long enough that you don't question it anymore. Leanne stayed for about 20 minutes, stroking Margaret's hair, talking to her. Then, she left. I sat in the dark of my study with my phone in my hand for a very long time. I want to tell you that I called the police immediately. I want to tell you I was decisive and clear-headed. But the truth is, I sat there for nearly 2 hours trying to convince myself of alternative explanations. That it was a prescribed medication I hadn't been told about. That Leanne had discussed it with Dr. Pereira. That I was a 62-year-old man suffering the cumulative grief of watching his wife disappear, and my mind was manufacturing threats that weren't there. But I kept coming back to that expression at the kitchen bench. the half-second she hadn't been able to help. In the morning, I did two things. First, I called Brendan in Cairns. My son is practical in a way I've always admired. He doesn't spiral. He problem solves. I told him what I'd seen and what I suspected, and there was a silence on the line that told me he had also noticed things he hadn't known what to do with. He said, "Dad, don't confront her. Don't let on. We need to know what she's giving Mum before we do anything." He was right. If I confronted Leanne without evidence, without knowing what was in that bottle, I had nothing. And if she was doing what I feared, confronting her might put Margaret at greater risk. Second, I made an appointment with a different doctor, a GP, in a suburb across town. Someone with no connection to our usual practice. I described Margaret's symptoms, the fluctuating pattern of decline and recovery. Everything I'd observed. He listened carefully. When I finished, he referred me to a specialist in toxicology. I will not use the toxicologist's name here, but I will say that she was the person who first said the word that I had been circling around and refusing to land on. She said, "The pattern I was describing, acute deterioration followed by partial recovery, repeated over months, was consistent with low-level, intermittent poisoning. Not a large dose all at once. Small doses. Administered irregularly. Designed to mimic the natural fluctuations of a chronic neurological condition. Designed to look like the disease." I drove home that afternoon through Brisbane traffic, and I did not cry. I think I was past the point where crying was available to me. I felt instead a cold, terrible clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a thing you've been refusing to know announces itself so plainly that refusal is no longer possible. I contacted the Queensland Police that evening. I asked to speak with someone from the Criminal Investigation Branch. I brought the camera footage on my phone, and I sat across from a detective, a woman named Senior Constable Ferris, who had the manner of someone who had heard difficult things before and knew how to hold them, and I showed her everything. I told her about the pattern of illness. I told her about the unknown bottle. I told her about the expression on Leanne's face at the kitchen bench. Senior Constable Ferris did not tell me I was overreacting. She asked me a series of methodical questions, and then she said they would need to move carefully, because they needed evidence that could stand up in court, and that meant not alerting Leanne that she was under investigation. This is the part of the story that I know was hardest to understand from the outside. I know, because I've since heard it from people who knew us, people who couldn't comprehend why I didn't act faster, more dramatically, why I didn't simply remove Leanne from the house that night. But the police were clear. If I acted unilaterally, if I confronted Leanne or removed her suddenly, she could destroy evidence, she could flee, and Margaret, the whole reason any of this mattered, might not get the protection and justice she deserved. I had to wait. I had to keep watching. I had to go on pretending that everything was normal, while Senior Constable Ferris and her colleagues built their case. I have never been a good actor. But for the next 11 days, I gave the performance of my life. I had breakfast with Leanne every morning. I thanked her for looking after her mother. I asked about her bookkeeping clients, about a friend of hers I'd met once, about a television program she'd mentioned. I watched her laugh and pour coffee and act the role of the devoted daughter. And I kept my face as open and neutral as I had kept bridge drawings when I knew there was a calculation error I hadn't yet corrected. Meanwhile, at night, I watched the camera footage. I documented everything. The times, the duration, what I could observe about the bottle, the dosage, any changes. I sent daily summaries to Brendan. I sent copies of the footage to Senior Constable Ferris. On the 8th day, while Leanne was out for her morning walk, police entered the house with a warrant and collected the bottle from Leanne's bathroom cabinet, along with several other items from her room. I was not there for this. I had been asked to be elsewhere at a cafe up the road. sitting with a cup of coffee I couldn't taste, watching the minutes on my phone. The substance in the bottle was identified within 48 hours. I won't go into every detail of what followed, because much of it is still part of the legal process. And some of it, I'm not ready to speak about plainly. What I will tell you is this. The substance was not a vitamin supplement. It was a compound that, administered in small doses over time, would suppress certain neurological functions and mimic the symptoms of the condition Margaret had already been diagnosed with. The same condition that made her fluctuating health so easy to explain away. Leanne had not caused the original illness. Margaret's condition was real and had been deteriorating genuinely before Leanne moved in. But Leanne had, it appears, recognized in that deterioration an opportunity. The more Margaret declined, the more control over her care and over the household, the finances, the future would fall to Leanne. There was also the matter of a will. Margaret had updated her will 18 months earlier, around the time Leanne moved in. A solicitor I'd never heard of. Provisions I hadn't been consulted about. I had signed documents I had believed were standard financial paperwork during a period when I was exhausted and trusting and not reading carefully enough. I am not a man who cries easily, as I said. But when Senior Constable Ferris sat across from me in a room at the police station and walked me through the timeline of what they believed had occurred, the planning of it, the patience of it, the cold architecture of it, I put my face in my hands and I wept in a way I hadn't since my father died. Leanne was arrested on a Thursday afternoon, outside a cafe on the Gold Coast where she had gone after telling me she was visiting a friend. I was not there for the arrest. Brendan was with me. He had driven down from Cairns the previous day. We were sitting in my back garden when Senior Constable Ferris called to tell me it was done. The charges were serious. I won't catalog them all here, but they included administering a harmful substance, fraud, and several counts related to the financial documents. Margaret is still with me. She is still declining. Her underlying condition continues. And there is no reversing what the additional substances did to her over those months. But she is declining at the honest pace of her actual illness now. Not at the accelerated pace that someone was engineering. Her last good week, a real good week, not a recovery from poisoning, but a genuine plateau. She sat in the garden with me, and we listened to the birds in the jacaranda tree, and she held my hand without speaking for a long time. I think she understood more than she could say. I think she knew something had changed. I have thought a great deal about what I missed, and when I could have seen it. I am an engineer. By training and by temperament, I believe in examining structures, in finding the load-bearing points, in asking whether what looks solid actually is. And yet, in my own home, in the structure that mattered most to me, I let a long time pass before I was willing to look directly at what was holding things up. I think many men of my generation, and I say this honestly, not as an excuse, were taught to see the home as safe ground, as the place where the complexity of the world was kept out. Work was where vigilance lived. Home was where you could lower your guard. I think that belief cost me, and it cost Margaret, a great deal. If I had one thing to say to any man or woman watching this, any person who has a feeling lodged in them, a small, sharp thing they've been choosing not to examine, it would be this. Trust the feeling. Not in a way that leads you to accusation without evidence. Not in a way that tears apart what might be innocent. But trust it enough to look, to ask questions, to watch carefully. The feeling is usually ahead of the understanding. And if you wait for certainty before you're willing to investigate, certainty may come too late. Do not mistake love for proof. The fact that someone loves you, or has loved you, or has performed love convincingly for years is not evidence that they are incapable of harm. Love and greed are not mutually exclusive. Devotion can be genuine and manipulative at the same time. The hardest betrayals are the ones that wear familiar faces. Get a second opinion. on medical matters, financial matters, legal matters, any matter where one person has become the sole interpreter of a situation you don't fully control. I trusted Dr. Pereira not because I had examined his reasoning, but because he was confident and I was tired. I trusted the documents I signed not because I had read them, but because I trusted my daughter. I am not blaming myself for being human, but I am saying tiredness is not the same as wisdom, and trust is not the same as verification. And finally, this. Do not protect people from the consequences of serious wrongs because you love them. I spent 11 days eating breakfast across from my daughter and pretending the world was ordinary, not to protect her, but to build the kind of evidence that would make justice possible. There were moments in those 11 days when some part of me wanted to find another explanation, wanted to discover that I had misread everything. Because having a daughter who did this was worse than the alternative. But wanting a different truth doesn't create one, and she had a mother who deserved whatever justice the law could offer. Margaret deserved that. Whatever happens next, she deserved that much. I am 63 years old, and I have learned later than I should have, at a cost I wouldn't wish on anyone, that the structures we build for love require the same integrity as anything else. They need to be examined. They need to be honest about their load. And when something is wrong at the foundation, you cannot patch the surface and pretend it will hold. You have to look at what is actually there.